water. Its power shaped some of the most famous features of the American landscape. Water also shaped the American story. First, it guided our growth, when waterways were the highways. Then we began to guide water with colossal engineering and an air of American destiny. But the future is not clear. Water is a finite resource and an increasing threat. Can we design a future that leaves us with enough and keeps us safe? Get a unique view of America, past, present, and future, through the lens of an irreplaceable resource, water. Before there was ever a United States of America, there was simply a continent. It was molded over millions of years, much of it sculpted by water. Rivers often start with a trickle of snowmelt and finish with a flourish into the sea. They carve pathways through every kind of geography. Some of water's work is ancient. The Colorado River is about 4 million years old, but it cut through 2 billion years of rock. The Grand Canyon is one of the most dramatic examples of water's artistic prowess. Big enough to see from space. Broader strokes are made by glaciers, massive rivers of frozen water that flow in super slow motion. They advance and recede over centuries to sculpt widescreen landscapes on a grand scale. One such vista is Yosemite in California. Imagine the valley filled to the brim with a frozen blue-white glacier, with Half Dome and the top of El Capitan poking out of the ice. It took 30 million years for glaciers to broaden and deepen the valley into what it is today. But some glacial carving is geologically brand new. Just 10,000 years ago, ice sheets receded northward from what is now Chicago. Meltwater filled in the basins carved by the retreating glaciers. The Great Lakes were born. And they now contain 20% of the accessible fresh water on Earth. Another feature of the young continent was wetlands. The Everglades was a vast, slow-moving river of grass, 60 miles wide and 100 miles long, meandering through South Florida. It contained an ever-shifting patchwork of ecosystems, with nature reshaping it in short order. It may have looked different from one year to the next, even before humans tried to reshape it themselves. The Mississippi Delta was another fluid landscape. Over thousands of years, the river carried sediments downstream and created almost 10,000 square miles of land, half of them wetlands on the Louisiana coast. But some of the most important water was invisible. Underneath the Great Plains is one of the world's largest supplies of underground water, the Ogallala Aquifer. It lies under portions of 8 states, from South Dakota down to Texas. Over millions of years, rain and snow filtered down through the earth, drop by drop, building up into a secret stash of fresh water. If pumped out all at once, it would cover all 50 states, a foot and a half deep. This is the legacy of water inherited by humans when they first wandered onto the continent. It has shaped the American story ever since. Today, Alaska is the farthest state you can drive to, the end of the American road. But thousands of years ago, it was a gateway, the beginning of a new continental journey. Siberia and Alaska used to be connected by the Bering Land Bridge. About 20,000 years ago, explorers from Asia trekked into the American continent. Over time, the migration splintered and scattered in every direction, geographically and genetically. Hundreds of tribes evolved, creating new languages, new cultures, new ways of adapting and living in a land now known as the lower 48 states. In the Pacific Northwest, the Salish people thrived on the rich waters of the coast and feasted on the salmon runs up the Columbia River. The Columbia supported many other tribes, including the Colville, Nez Perce, Spokane, and Yakima. Farther south, the Colorado River was the lifeline of the desert Southwest. Peoples like the Fremont, Anasazi, and Hohokam lived off its life-giving flow. The Ohio River sustained tribes like the Osage, Omaha, and Shawnee. The Mississippi River saw the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, and Ojibwe. The mighty Missouri River drew the Lakota, Mandan, and Blackfeet, among many others. The First Nations that gathered around the Great Lakes included the Erie people, the Ho-Chunk, and the Menominee. Water influenced the migrations and cultures of Native Americans for more than 10,000 years. But in just a few hundred years, it would all change into a new world unrecognizable from the old, except that water was still a driving force. America's Atlantic coast is a welcoming landscape. More than 2,000 miles of shore that beckoned newcomers from Europe and beyond. By the 17th century, the influx over the Atlantic was in full motion. There were explorers, visitors, settlers, and slaves. Certain spots on the coast became the gateways. Their stories and landmarks are world famous. Jamestown, Virginia, the first permanent English settlement in America. They picked this site partly because it was surrounded by water on 3 sides. Plymouth, Massachusetts, where the Mayflower pulled ashore in December of 1620. Many passengers were fleeing religious persecution. But coming to the New World in the dead of winter created a brand new set of challenges. Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Newcomers were drawn here by waters teeming with cod. It provided both sustenance for the immigrants and a business opportunity to export it back to Mother England. Boston, whose first settlers chose a spot on the Shawmut Peninsula, surrounded by Massachusetts Bay and the Charles River. The peninsula had 3 prominent hills, and all are still part of the downtown landscape. And New York City, where the Statue of Liberty eventually welcomed millions, famously described by poet Emma Lazarus as, "You're tired, you're poor, you're huddled masses, yearning to breathe free." But America's west coast was not nearly as welcoming. 2 colliding tectonic plates created a mountainous coastline. Prevailing winds and steeper slopes created bigger waves. But when immigration finally did transform this coast, it came in like a Pacific storm. In the early 1800s, California was a sleepy province of Mexico, populated mostly by Spanish speakers and Native Americans. But they were completely overrun in 1848 by the gold rush. Fortune seekers raced into California. Some went across the country in wagon trains on the Oregon Trail. It still looks plenty rugged today. Bouncing over thousands of miles on wooden wheels was a hardship that is now etched into the American story. But at the outset of the gold rush, more than a third of the gold seekers took an alternate route, by sea. They set sail from the East Coast, went all the way around the tip of South America and back up the Pacific coast. 14,000 miles, 7 months, on sometimes modest vessels facing countless hazards. One New Yorker, Alexander Van Valen, set sail in the winter of '49. 4 months into his journey, he lamented the boredom and lack of exercise. "A sailor's life is a dog's life," he wrote. "But now I shudder with a different perception. A dog's life is far better." After 200 days, he made it, weakened but ready to grab his share of fortune. Or so he hoped, along with everybody else pouring into California. In 1850, San Francisco's population quintupled, and most came by sea. The harbor master reckoned 62,000 arrived on ships that year alone, including Americans from the East and Asians from across the Pacific. As they headed inland, many of their ships were abandoned in what was then called Yerba Buena Cove. They were used for storage, floating hotels, however a ship could be turned into usable space in a boomtown. Ships that couldn't be put to use were simply sunk right there in the cove. Later, it was filled in to make more land. And that's right where downtown San Francisco was built. In 2001, workers excavating the site of an old downtown building discovered the remains of a gold rush ship called the General Harrison. It arrived from Massachusetts in 1850. Archaeologists had a brief chance to study it before it was covered up again by an 11-story building. On the Columbia River, bordering Washington and Oregon, a different kind of gold rush attracted newcomers. This time, the lure was salmon. The supply seemed endless. In the 1860s, the advent of canning allowed salmon to be packaged and shipped. It didn't take long for the world to get a taste for it. Canneries sprang up along the Columbia, 55 of them by 1883, manned mostly by Chinese immigrants. That year alone, they produced 30 million cans of salmon. Whether immigrants came to America from east or west, arriving at the coast wasn't always the end of the journey. America's inland waterways shaped how the interior of the nation was settled. The most famous inland journey of discovery was Lewis and Clark. They were sent by Thomas Jefferson in 1804 to explore land he had just purchased from the French. 828,000 square miles for about 3 cents an acre. Lewis and Clark set sail from a camp near St. Louis, went up the Mississippi to the fork with the Missouri, and took a left. They were headed west against the river's current. Among the stated goals for the expedition was to find a water route to the Pacific for what Jefferson called the purpose of commerce. They were a party of 30 or so men, including a slave, and later, a young Native American teenage girl they hired as a guide. They came across every kind of landscape, weather, and hazard. They discovered animals completely foreign to them, along with Native American tribes both curious and wary. Finally, they encountered the Rocky Mountains. The Continental Divide runs the length of the Rockies. A raindrop on one side of the ridge flows to the Pacific. A drop on the other side flows to the Atlantic. But to Lewis and Clark, it was simply a barrier. So they followed tributaries of the Missouri so far as to stand up and straddle either side of a creek. And upon climbing what he thought would be the final summit, Lewis imagined the other side to be a downward slope all the way to the ocean. Instead, he saw nothing but more mountains as far as he could see. After weeks of bushwhacking and portaging on foot, they found the Clearwater River. They were back on the water, this time with the current. They joined the Snake River and finally the Columbia. They followed the Columbia all the way to the Pacific. It took 18 months of exploration, mostly by water, with Clark estimating the distance they had traveled. By his reckoning, they had gone 4,162 miles to the Pacific. Modern measurements show he was only 40 miles off. Now, they needed to pick a site to camp for the winter. Until now, it had been strictly a military expedition. But after a year and a half of giving orders, Lewis and Clark opened it up to a vote. Sacagawea, the teenage Shoshone girl, voted. Clark's slave, a black man named York, voted. On the banks of a river that wasn't even American territory yet, the expedition took a page from the future and allowed every one of its members a voice. Their journey remains a testament to the spirit of exploration and the budding concept of democracy. Later in the 19th century, when America's wave of immigration arrived on shore, many continued into the country's interior on its natural network of rivers. Name a city, and there's a good chance it was settled via water. Cincinnati, founded at the confluence of the Licking and Ohio rivers. It became a magnet for German settlers and a hub of river commerce. Midwestern pork, flour, and whiskey flowed through town, often headed for plantations in the antebellum South. Business boomed, and by the 1850s, Cincinnati was almost 4 times bigger than Chicago. Pittsburgh, at the intersection of 3 rivers. the Ohio, the Monongahela, and the Allegheny. When steel production became Pittsburgh's calling card, river barges hauled it out in 3 different directions to a growing nation. It was the interstate exchange of its day. Minneapolis and St. Paul, twin cities born when the U.S. military convinced the Dakota Sioux to sell some land so it could build a fort where the Mississippi and Minnesota rivers meet. Boise, Idaho, on the Boise River, which looked like an oasis to early explorers. Surrounded by the dry, rough Rockies, it was a blue ribbon of water surrounded by green cottonwood trees. Albuquerque, New Mexico, straddling the banks of the Rio Grande, founded as a Spanish colonial outpost. It started as a farming community, drawing water from the river for crops and sheep herding. The Willamette Valley of Oregon, blessed with a river lined with abundant resources and rich soil. It was publicized in the 1820s as a promised land of flowing milk and honey. Many who braved the Oregon Trail were on their way here. For more than a century, water dictated the direction of American migration. But ingenuity and engineering soon turned that model on its head. Americans were going to dictate the direction of water. As newcomers continued to settle into the nation's midsection, they found a region teeming with natural resources. In Minnesota, vast forests were harvested to house and provide warmth for a growing population. In Illinois, fertile lands gave new farmers a fighting chance to succeed and plant family roots that would last for generations. In Michigan's Upper Peninsula, some riches were underground. Just 5 years after becoming a state, various ores like iron were discovered. But these resources remained mostly locked in by land, with nature offering no easy way out to a broader market. Until America made its own way. In 1825, the Erie Canal was completed. 363 miles of artificial waterway connecting the Hudson River to Lake Erie. It took 8 years to dig out by hand with the help of pack animals and explosives. Then, in 1848, the Illinois and Michigan Canal connected Lake Michigan to the Illinois and Mississippi rivers. With these 2 canals, there was now an inland waterway from New York City all the way to New Orleans. The breadbasket of America was open for business. People poured into the region, and commodities poured out. Cranberries from Wisconsin, corn from Iowa, and wheat from Kansas. Now these goods could reach a broader market, thanks to a new economic thoroughfare made of water. Towns on the route blossomed into full-blown cities. Cleveland, Ohio, on the south shore of Lake Erie. Winters were harsh and nearby land could be swampy. A city grew up anyway, thanks to its very busy port. But it was not just a shipping stop. Cleveland grew into a manufacturing power, known for taking in raw elements from the mines and putting out finished machinery for the masses, such as cars, steam engines, and iron beams for construction. Milwaukee, Wisconsin, overlooking Lake Michigan. In the 1840s, German immigrants flowed in via the new water route from the east. And they brought their beer recipes with them. By 1900, a full third of Milwaukee's population was of German ancestry. With such a high density of countrymen, German culture flourished on the shores of Lake Michigan and in the surrounding farm fields. One of their lasting legacies was the concept of preschool, Thanks to German immigrants, every American kid goes to kindergarten, a tradition that began in this schoolhouse in Watertown. Chicago, Illinois. It was founded as a town of about 200 people in 1833. Thanks in part to the canals that would soon connect it to the rest of the country, Chicago became the fastest growing city in the world for much of the 19th century. The engineering of water took an interesting twist in Chicago. In 1856, the city began installing the nation's first comprehensive sewage system. Step one was raising central Chicago to a new grade, basically jacking it up, street by street and building by building. This would allow gravity to work its magic. But the sewage drained into the Chicago River, which then drained into Lake Michigan, polluting Chicago's source of drinking water. To remedy the problem, engineers reversed the flow of the Chicago River, forcing its waters and Chicago's sewage in the opposite direction, away from the lake. But at the very bottom of this new shipping route through the nation was the gateway to the ocean. New Orleans. No place else can claim the gumbo of influences that molded the Crescent City. By 1850, it was the fourth largest port in the world. The docks would have been chock full of goods on their way in or out of the country. Meat, grain, sugar, and most famously, cotton. The process began all over the Deep South, at thousands of plantations. Sharecroppers, tenant farmers, and slaves tended the delicate crop from planting to picking. The Mississippi River connected this back-breaking work to the rest of the world. Picked and bundled cotton made its way down the Mississippi and over the ocean, where it could be spun into goods for a global market. A customer in Great Britain or Brazil could buy clothing that originated in the fields of Alabama or Arkansas. But the new demand for cotton created more demand for slaves. The Mississippi River became the conduit to bring more slaves south. Many were auctioned off in New Orleans. Plantation owners were frequent buyers. This is the origin of the phrase, sold down the river. But after the Civil War, human bondage slowly gave way to human ingenuity. By the 20th century, America would harness water to fulfill its growing thirst for expansion. With canals and locks opening more regions to settlement and commerce, modern America was taking shape. But that shape was forever altered when we chose to override the forces of nature. The Hoover Dam, completed in 1936, tamed the mighty Colorado. While the river was a natural marvel, it was also an agricultural headache. Some farmers weren't getting the water they needed, and others faced acres of ruined crops when the river flooded. The Hoover Dam turned the river into a resource to be managed and a source of power to be harnessed. Water shooting through its turbines generates power for 1.3 million people in Nevada, Arizona, and California. The dam's maximum power rating is 2,080 megawatts, or almost 3 million horsepower. When the dam went online, the rivers of the Colorado built up behind it, creating a brand new lake with a surface area bigger than Lake Tahoe. They named it Lake Mead, the largest reservoir in America. It creates power, irrigation, and plenty of recreation in the otherwise parched American Southwest. The Hoover Dam is just one example of engineering water to serve a growing nation. Another is the Shasta Dam in California. Also built in the 1930s, it allowed the Sacramento River to be tapped for power and irrigation, creating one of the most fertile growing regions in the world, California's Central Valley. Once, it was a grassland prairie, but a series of dams, canals, and pumps turned it into an agricultural wonderland. At one point, the Central Valley grew 25% of the food eaten in the United States. But we didn't just divert water to grow crops. In some cases, we grew cities. In the early 20th century, Los Angeles was already a growing town. But officials feared that scarcity of water would limit its growth and its real estate values. 230 miles to the north lay the Owens Valley. At that time, it was fertile farmland, fed by the Owens River and capped by the blue-green Owens Lake. With ingenuity, hubris, and a fair amount of deception, a few conspirators bought up the rights to the river, and officials built an aqueduct all the way to LA. No pumps were necessary. It's downhill all the way. For 100 years and counting, Los Angeles has grown into an urban jungle that is mostly watered from afar. And as the original developers envisioned, real estate is still priced like gold. Elsewhere, the problem wasn't scarcity of water, it was an overabundance. In late 19th century Florida, the Everglades was putting a chokehold on development. You couldn't farm it, and you couldn't build on it. Then Governor Broward wanted to, quote, drain that abominable, pestilence-ridden swamp. It started in the 1880s when a developer named Hamilton Diston bought 4 million acres of Florida swamp, an area the size of Connecticut, for 25 cents an acre. A modest canal system tried to drain some of it for agriculture. The canals didn't always work so well, but the word was out, true or not. Wetland could be turned into land and turn a profit. Within 4 years, the value of Diston's purchase doubled. The Florida land boom was on. Decades of development followed, turning South Florida into a hot destination, but also an ecological mess. Today, the Everglades is hanging on, thanks to a change of heart about the natural value of wetlands. Another region has grappled with water since the very beginning. New Orleans was first laid out as 14 city blocks. Even then, each block was surrounded by a drainage ditch. That's what you have to do when you build a city just a few feet above sea level, surrounded by water. As New Orleans grew, it had little land to grow on. So low-lying swamps were drained in small sections to make way for new neighborhoods. Then, officials began to think bigger. In the early 1900s, the vast swamp between the city and Lake Pontchartrain was drained, increasing the city's urban acreage by 700%. But flooding has always been a threat, no more so than with Hurricane Katrina in 2005. Katrina devastated some areas of the city, and they are still recovering. This set New Orleans back, but also moved engineering ideas forward. After Katrina, the Army Corps of Engineers embarked on building the biggest defense yet, a surge barrier almost 2 miles long and the largest drainage pumping station in the world. New Orleans is a living experiment in how far we can push water before water pushes back. Today, modern America benefits from a vast network of highways and railways. In the public eye, our lakes and rivers are more about recreation than transportation. There are now more than 4 million recreational watercraft in the country. Fishing is still an important industry. For example, the lobster in Maine are still critical to the local economy. But for many coastal residents, water no longer provides the livelihood it once did. Fisheries are depleted after centuries of bountiful catches. So living on the water is more of an aesthetic choice rather than economic. Consider the story of Newport, Rhode Island. It rose to prominence as a whaling town, with Portuguese immigrants bringing their expertise to turn sperm whales into commodities such as oil, candles, and perfume. Later, its port became a hub for moving textiles, chocolate, and rum. As a result, it also became an epicenter of piracy. Legal or not, Newport's economy was based on waterborne commerce. But things began to change in the mid-1800s. Wealthy business tycoons, looking for cooler summers, began building what they called cottages in seaside Newport. This one is called the Breakers, built by the Vanderbilts in the 1890s. It sits on 13 acres, with cliffs that careen down to the Atlantic Ocean. Inside, there are 70 rooms, totaling over 125,000 square feet. Though the house was large enough to throw grand parties, there were only a few extra bedrooms. Guests were presumed to have cottages of their own. And so began the trend of coastal living without needing the coast to live. Today, most people who live on the water do not subsist on it. Those who do, like local fishermen, often struggle to afford the increasing costs of living near the sea. But there are still people who make a living on the water. Some in small boats, and some just a little bit bigger. The story of modern shipping is the story of container ships. The biggest ones can carry 11,000 20-foot containers. With America's thirst for imports, there's a good chance much of your household was once boxed up and carried by ship. It may have come to shore in Miami. This port turns around an average of 4 ships per day, loading and unloading everything from furniture to fruits. It handles about 8 million tons of cargo every year. This evolution in shipping transformed one of America's most famous bays. When container ships reach San Francisco, they don't stop where all the passengers disembarked for the gold rush. San Francisco's famous hills are a barrier to big ocean commerce. Instead, the ships continue on to Oakland. Surrounded by flatter land and closer to highways and railroads, Oakland became the next boomtown on the bay. There is room to stack up containers like building blocks as they await their inland journey by a truck or train. So while San Francisco grew up on the influx of people, Oakland grew up on the influx of stuff. By 1970, it became the Bay Area's leading port. The American economy came of age with the power of water. But The industry that rose on its banks became the curse that fouled its future. For the better part of the country's lifespan, pollution controls were weak, if they existed at all. Anyone could dump just about anything, just about anywhere. Raw sewage, chemicals, and oils poured into our lakes, rivers, and seas. By the 1960s, America's waters were on life support. There were record fish kills, sharp drops in fishery populations that could only be attributed to pollution. In 1969, a Florida lake reported the biggest kill ever, 26 million fish, blamed on discharge from nearby food processing plants. One study found that pollution in the Chesapeake Bay was costing the fishing industry $3 million a year. Officials sampled the Hudson River and found bacteria levels 170 times the safe limit. The Charles River in Boston became such a foul soup that a boater who fell into the water had to seek medical treatment for skin rashes. Lake Erie was written off as dead by Time magazine. Finally, the Cuyahoga River near Cleveland was so polluted, it actually caught fire in 1969. Flames floated right down the river. Investigators blamed waters choked with petroleum derivatives, volatile enough to be ignited by a wayward spark. By 1972, 2/3 of the nation's lakes, rivers, and coastal waters were unsafe for fishing or swimming. That year, the government finally responded with the Clean Water Act. Considered one of the broadest environmental laws ever, its goal was to, quote, restore and maintain the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of our nation's waters. More than 40 years later, it has not been a perfect recovery, but success stories abound. It stopped billions of pounds of pollution from spilling into waterways, allowing them to self-cleanse over time. And since so many American cities were settled around water, cleaner downtown waters helped revitalize the urban core. People started coming back from the suburbs. Kansas City was founded at the junction of two rivers. In the 1800s, meatpacking plants dumped slaughterhouse waste right in, streaking them red with blood. Today, they run a much cleaner blue, framing a vibrant city center. In Oklahoma City, the North Canadian River used to flow through downtown. But when it got stinkier and occasionally flooded, officials rerouted the river around town. The original riverbed became an urban eyesore, an overgrown drainage ditch that had to be mowed 3 times a year. But with cleaner waters and a trend to revitalize urban centers, the city diverted the river back through downtown and renamed it the Oklahoma River. Now it hosts world-class kayak competitions. Modern America is a product of many forces, with water carving a distinct path through its history. But what about its future? Can we adapt to waters that rise? Or waters that disappear? Modern Las Vegas was built on the promise of cheap, plentiful water and power from the Hoover Dam and Lake Mead. In the long run, that promise may be a mirage. Surrounding Lake Mead is what locals call the bathtub ring. It illustrates the drop in water level caused by years of drought. Unless fortunes change, a lot of fortunes could be lost. The water level has gone below 40% of its capacity. Soon, it may go below the level of the intakes that pump it to Las Vegas. They're building a new one even deeper. Already, residents are pitching in and using less. Officials are forcing conservation. Planting a water-gulping front lawn is now illegal. Las Vegas could be forced to reckon with a radical future, reverting back to a true desert city, where water is as precious as gold. Efforts to keep the city afloat could be the biggest gamble yet. It's a story duplicated all the way down the depleted Colorado River. Almost 30 dams, including the Glen Canyon Dam in Arizona, have turned the river into what amounts to a controllable faucet. Countless canals divert its water to some 4 million acres of cropland. Arizona would be even more parched without the Colorado River fanning out in a spiderweb of canals. It allowed the population of Phoenix to double. In California, some of the most productive farms increasingly rely on the state's share of diverted river water. The area's drought makes this imported water even more critical. Droughts come and go, but human alterations to the landscape can be permanent. Remember the Owens River Valley, drained to slake the thirst of Los Angeles? Now it's so dry that winds whip up thick clouds of noxious alkali dust, causing health problems and even traffic jams. Underground water is also disappearing. In California's Central Valley, farmers pump up groundwater from more than 100,000 wells, few of which are monitored or regulated. In the last century, they've pulled out a volume of water equivalent to over 4 Lake Meads. It is causing the valley floor to sink about 6 inches per year. At one spot, the ground sank almost 30 feet in 50 years. And back in the nation's midsection, the massive Ogallala Aquifer is being tapped faster than nature can replenish it. One year, scientists realized that farmers depleted the water level by 6 feet, and nature only replenished a ½ inch. One reason is the type of food America prefers. Beef is still one of our favorite meals. But raising cattle takes a lot of water, mostly to grow the food they eat. In the end, a single hamburger takes 600 gallons of water to produce. Scarcity of fresh water is a looming national challenge. Another is the slow rise of the sea. Ocean waters now lap up against some of America's biggest cities. Scientists fear that innocuous waves could soon cause increasingly destructive erosion and disastrous floods. Driven by climate change, sea level is projected to rise at least 3 feet, perhaps within a century. As the level rises, there is a lot in water's way. In Galveston, Texas, a 17-foot seawall protects the low-lying city. But in 2008, Hurricane Ike, a Category 2 storm, breached the wall and caused widespread flooding. With higher seas in the forecast, a bigger storm could be a decisive blow. In Norfolk, Virginia, city officials estimate it will cost at least $1 billion to protect the city from rising seas. The Outer Banks of North Carolina could be decimated, with some barrier islands already falling apart. San Diego's entire infrastructure is at risk. Erosion and flooding could jeopardize its power grid, water supply, and transportation network. For over 2 centuries, Americans gathered where water was plentiful for farming or accessible for travel. Centuries from now, some of those settlements may be abandoned. Will we be able to engineer ourselves out of harm's way? Or will water chart its own course and carve out its own future? Water has a power all its own. Its importance ripples from coast to coast. As a resource, as recreation, and as a requirement for life itself. It cut through time, nourished our growth, and continues to write a fundamental storyline of American history. The poet W.H. Auden was an immigrant who came to America by sea in 1939. He once wrote, "Thousands have lived without love, not one without water."